Welcome to our 11th lecture on prosody. In the last lecture, we talked about the way we can use prosody to mark out phonemes, morphemes, syllables, and words. And this time, we'll talk about how we can sequence those and connect them, since we don't just use all of that information in isolation. So we'll talk a bit about prosodic co-articulation, tone Sandhi, and stress in noun-noun compounding, using English as an example. So you may be familiar with co-articulation in the context of segmental content, so different phonemes, when adjacent to each other, influence each other and the way they're realized. And the same thing happens prosodically. So you might consider the case where you've been diligently practicing your Mandarin tones and you've gotten very good at saying those in isolation, and then you start building up longer words and need to be able to pronounce tones with neighboring tones in sequence. And in some cases, as here, if you want to say a high tone 1 followed by a high falling tone 4, no problem, that's very straightforward. However, if you want to produce two tone 4s next to each other, high falling tones, it's very hard to, or impossible, to simply reset your articulators and go from that low final pitch on the first tone 4 up to that high initial pitch on the second tone 4. So what do? We actually end up producing a modified version in sequence, where we might start our first tone 4 higher, and our second one then starts at a lower pitch and still continues to fall. Now, this isn't a problem because the sort of salient characteristic of tone 4 is this steep falling contour, so it's still recognizable. And what we're getting here is a pronunciation that is intelligible, but sort of manages the constraints on our articulators and their transition while still maintaining intelligibility and the sort of essential characteristics of the tone 4. We can look at another example here where we have the low dipping rising tone, tone 3, followed by a tone 4. And in this case, we often end up with a pronunciation that is sort of a smooth kind of interpolation between the two, where neither tone target is fully realized. So the initial tone 3 doesn't rise as quickly, and the second tone 4 doesn't start off at as high of a pitch, but they're still recognizable as themselves. And the essence, again, of that tone 4, that steep fall, is still adequately captured. And this is particularly prevalent in informal or rapid speech, where the sort of underlying targets, the underlying definitional targets of the tones are not fully realized, but in context, it's still interpretable as the sort of primary characteristics of the tones are retained. Now, we can consider a different type of context here, a sequence of tone 3s, where another phenomenon comes into play, and this is the phenomenon so-called of tone Sandhi. And here, instead of this sort of interpolation that we're getting, we apply a phonological rule that when you have tone 3s in sequence, the first, say, tone 3 before a pair of tone 3s changes to a tone 2, followed by a tone 3. This is actually present in one of the most common phrases in Mandarin, so the hello, sort of welcome, ni hao, where the first tone converts to a second tone and the second to a tone remains a tone 3. And this rule is prevalent throughout Mandarin, and there are a number of other phonological rules that apply in Mandarin specifically, and also many different types of phonological rules that apply across the world's tone languages. So tone spreading is common in many languages as well, and that's based on particular phonological rules. Now, these particular changes there are basically due to either rule-based phonological processes or actually articulatory constraints. And they're largely independent of the meaning of the particular words or phones or syllables. Now we can shift over and look at some examples of stress behavior in English where there are interactions between prosody and syntax and semantics. So here we have some examples of initial words and their resultant forms and stress patterns after affixation with 4 different affixes. So why don't you take a moment, maybe pause the recording, and look at the patterns that are present here. Okay, welcome back. So you'll see here, for example, in the first block, where we have approve converted to the nominal approval by adding the ul affix. In this case, there is no shift in stress. It's the ul affixation process is actually a little more confusing than that, and you can see that below. In contrast, if we take the ease affix, which is often used for marking languages, then we see that actually there is a change in the stress pattern from its original location to sort of one to the right. So it shifts one syllable over. And different affixes have different types of effects on the stress patterns of the sort of base word to which they're being affixed. And if you look at the Creedler book, you can see a number of examples in more detail. This happens not only in affixation, but also in phrasal structures. So how does that manifest? So we have an example here that we've got in the guise of a quiz. So I'll just read this. So Dr. Francisco Terrera is originally from Spain. He's a professor in the linguistics department at McGill University, where he teaches phonetics and prosody. Now, there's a couple of alternative ways to finish this out. So A, Francisco is a Spanish professor. B, Francisco is a Spanish professor. And C, none of the above. So how would you answer this? Which of these is the appropriate wrap-up? So it's A, where we have stress on both Spanish and professor. This is in contrast to B, where, so in that case, we have an adjective-noun configuration, where you would be talking about someone who teaches Spanish. You would actually have a noun-noun compound, and that leads to de-stressing on the final noun. So in this way, the semantics and syntax interact with the prosody and give rise to the actual form that we observe. We'll also see, and you can see in future readings, that the different uses of prosody in some languages to carry out this sort of information versus using syntactic or semantic or morphological markers. Another example of this sort of trade-off between using an explicit morphological marker and using prosody can be seen here. So we could talk about Niebuhr's insight and use a morphological possessive, the apostrophe S, or we could just say the Niebuhr insight in order to capture that same sort of semantic relationship. So there are interactions among prosody, syntax, semantics, morphology that make the whole process considerably more complicated and also interesting. So now you've seen some examples of how sequencing can affect and interact with the prosody as in tone and stress languages, and in the next lecture you'll see how that works out in terms of larger prosodic structures. Thank you very much.